Hello. I am still figuring this out. I've never done a live before. um, Not sure how to tell who's watching or all of that. So, completely in the dark here. But, anyways, I'm going to start doing. Find a good angle here. So I don't have a glare. I'm going to start doing some live Q&As on the page here. I had a couple of questions on my personal page, and I'm kind of trying to push myself into doing videos. So I'm going to start out by doing a live Q&As, and I'm going to try to do one every week. So what I'll plan on doing is making a post earlier in the week, and then probably doing lives around on Fridays on the regular, depending on what my Fridays look like. Fridays are usually my work at home days. So that's what I will plan on doing. So yeah, I will keep the questions anonymous unless someone says, like, oh yeah, no problem, you can say my first name. But for the most part, during the videos, I won't mention anyone's names. And if you don't want to post your question like publicly, you can just message me on my page, or if you're on my personal Facebook, you can message me there. If you don't know who I am and you're like, who is this chick talking? I am Vanessa Pruitt. I'm a provisionally licensed mental health professional in Nebraska. I know not everyone on my page lives in Nebraska, but I can see clients through telehealth. My main office is with Clearwater Counseling in Grand Island, Nebraska. So if you live in the area and you're looking for a therapist, I am looking for clients. So let's get started here. Let me pull up my questions. It really bothers me when I'm recording and I can't see myself, but I'm going to be going over to this other page to look at the questions. So the first question I got was, I have a question about working with a therapist. As the patient, should I tell the therapist I want to sort out how I am processing trauma, or just talk about the trauma and wait for suggestions? Both approaches seem awkward. So I will start off by saying that most people are really nervous about bringing up their trauma or bringing up something they went through that was really difficult. And that is completely understandable because, not every space, hopefully every therapist's office is a safe place, but not every space is safe or has ever been safe for talking about what you've went through. So that being said, therapists are very used to trauma coming up at all different stages of the therapy process. So we have people who they come to therapy, that's their main goal. They're like, I went through this. This was my childhood, or this is the thing that I experienced. This was the traumatic relationship that I was in. All of the above. And that's why they're in therapy. They want to work through that. Others, they're coming to therapy for something else first, and then either they know they have a trauma and they just haven't brought it up with their therapist yet, or it comes out later on in therapy, or through the process of therapy, they realize that certain things in their life were very traumatic. And they realize they have trauma, and they didn't necessarily know was trauma. Kind of all that to say is however, it doesn't matter. I'm going to say it really doesn't matter how you bring it up. It's way more awkward in your head than it is to your therapist, because your therapist is used to that. They're not probably not going to be surprised. If they are really surprised, then maybe it's not the best therapist. I don't know, but most therapists are not going to be super surprised if you one day just bringing something up. Um, Anytime you bring it up is going to be okay, and it's not going to be as awkward as you think in your head. At least I don't. In most cases, it won't be. Um, I would say try to bring it up more towards the beginning or the middle of your session. It's kind of difficult for your therapist when you're bringing up a trauma at the end of the session, and you know, they're like, oh, I'm sorry, like I really want to talk about this with you, but we're gonna have to like wait. And that can also be really difficult for you, especially if it's a trauma that you haven't processed a lot or could bring up some really difficult feelings for you. It might not be in your best interest to bring that up at the end of a session and then go home and be, now you're thinking about it. Now you're thinking about how awkward it was to bring up to your therapist, and you're ruminating on it until your next session. So let's see if I had any other thoughts about that. Oh yeah, I was going to say that however you bring it up, every therapist is going to be a little bit different in how they approach trauma work, or depending on what their specialty is, whether they're going to think it's best to refer you out to like maybe someone who specializes in trauma. Although I would say most therapists are equipped to work with someone who has trauma, but if you're wanting to do deep trauma work, I really, really suggest seeking out someone who specializes in trauma work. And last note about that is that you should hopefully be working with a therapist where you always feel comfortable during trauma work or whenever you bring up trauma, that whenever you need to slow down or you know, kind of ease into how you talk about or process your trauma in therapy. Trauma therapy should be, and usually is, one of the slower therapy processes. It's usually long-term work, because especially when we're talking about something like complex trauma, where you had repeated traumas throughout childhood or throughout relationships, or very deep attachment wounds, attachment disturbances. You know, those are long-term work. You're going to be processing the trauma, working through things, and building skills. Should be a process, and maybe something that you do some work, you take a break, you come back a year or two later, you know, that kind of thing. I'm not saying like you have to be in therapy for the rest of your life, but I think when with people who have trauma, that should always be a tool that's available to them, because things are going to come up. So I think that's all I have for that question. For the person, you know who you are, who asked that question. If you have any follow-up questions, just let me know, and yeah, I can add them to the next Q&A. So let's go on to the second question, and that was, I think they wanted to know about tips for noticing when something triggers a trauma reaction that you didn't realize was there. I'm not sure how to phrase it, but when you notice being around toxic behaviors in hindsight, how to notice them in the moment and drawing boundaries around that. I love this question. This is a great question because it has to do with some of the core of trauma work and working through how trauma comes up in your current life. Um, so I would say that it definitely takes time to learn how to identify your triggers, and it takes even more time to be able to recognize them in the moment. Like, do not feel like you should just be able to get this and understand this. This is usually quite a very long process for people, especially again people with complex trauma, because if you grew up in an abusive household, or neglectful household, or you experienced some very deep traumas as a young child, um, or even were in relationships for many, many years that were abusive, you have a lot of triggers. I'm just gonna say, um, I don't know what of my other videos you've watched, but I've talked about trauma neural networks. So we have neural networks, so what are networks of neurons in our brains, where we store traumatic events, basically. But these are stored in things like sensations, people, um, like sight, sounds, memories, feelings, situations, the way people handle situations, the way people interact with us. It sounds like, you're talking about relational triggers. Um, and yeah, those are very prevalent in complex trauma. I would say that the beginning, the beginning to understanding your triggers and how they happen in the moment, and it's the beginning to understanding all trauma triggers, is body awareness. Um, so every therapist will say it, we'll say it a million times, trauma is stored in the body. Um, and if you are someone with complex trauma, um, or you grew up in a difficult household, you definitely have, and you may not recognize yet, the body cues of your triggers. And this is something that you can work with a therapist to figure out, but I would start with, if you know maybe what the trigger is, because it sounds like you kind of have an idea of what it was that triggered you. You're just wanting to recognize it sooner. Is to start to really pay attention to what are those things that happen when you're triggered. Are you in pain? I'll be really honest, for me it's pain. So if someone is really disrespecting my boundaries and such, I'm in pain. And for some people it's a stomach ache. For some people it's headaches. For some people it's just really, really bad anxiety. For some people it is a shutdown state where you say you have an interaction with someone and then the next day you don't feel like you can get out of bed. You are really aloof, like you're kind of disconnected from everyone. If you have a spouse or children or whatever, you're kind of, it's like you're somewhere else all day. That's kind of dissociation. Or you just feel really tired and, those kind of things. And I can come up with a more comprehensive list when it's not on the fly, and I could make a video about that. But it's really about starting there. And I don't want to, give a whole lesson today, but it also really starts with understanding the nervous system and really also building body awareness into times when you're not triggered. So mindfulness and breathing and meditation, if you're into that kind of thing. Those kind of things that I can talk a bit more about in future videos. That being said, um, yes, boundaries are very important. Usually, initially, sometimes, especially if you're dealing with things that are kind of shutting you down and making your mental health worse, making your life harder, it's good to set some really firm boundaries and put some distance between you and that person or you and that type of situation. Um, but not all trauma triggers should necessarily be avoided. Um, so I know that's kind of convoluted, um, but I do want to tell you something that you would be doing if you were working with a therapist, and you can kind of do this on your own, but it's really helpful to work with a therapist to kind of facilitate you understanding this process and like choosing certain uh, triggers or situations and things to work on. Um, but when we're working with trauma and triggers in particular, we're looking at what we call is the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is the window of experiences, or it can be talking about your trauma or experiencing things that trigger the trauma. We all have a window of tolerance. So for people who don't have trauma, who don't have a lot of mental health issues, their window of tolerance is usually larger. When we have trauma, our window of tolerance is usually much smaller, especially if we're also a highly sensitive person, that kind of thing. So when we're talking about the window of tolerance, we're talking about at the upper end, when do we go into kind of fight or flight? When does our anxiety reach max? When we're talking about anxiety, our window of tolerance, the top is like a panic attack, right? Same kind of goes for trauma, though. The top would be, you could have a panic attack, or you're hyperventilating, or you're just dissociation and detachment can also be at the top. So the bottom, and hello to the two people who just hopped on and are watching, the bottom of the window of tolerance would be also kind of the shutdown. When do we completely disassociate or completely shut down, and we can't talk about it, we can't deal with it. The goal in working with our triggers is to expand our window of tolerance, and that can be quite a process in complex trauma. By expanding the window of tolerance, I'm trying to think of a good example. It would be, let's say we're talking about something relational, dealing with a mother-in-law, let's say, and we start at a window of tolerance where it may be at the point where we need to just take a break from mother-in-law because we can't even have a conversation with that person without hitting one of these points. So by expanding the window of tolerance, we'd be doing something like trying to expose ourselves to it in a controlled way. So it might be a phone call to mother-in-law that's scripted. And this may not be a good example at all for most people, but what we're looking for is to use that body awareness that we have to stay within this window of tolerance. And we do what's called titrating. And this is something that if you're working with a therapist who specializes in trauma, they will do this like during a therapy session. So if you're talking about a trauma experience in the past, or um, yeah, talking through an experience that you had. For some people, they come into therapy and they can't even, they can't even say what happened to them. And we'd be working with that window of tolerance to see what it is we can build up to without hitting either of these, the top or the bottom points. I hope that makes sense, the way I'm explaining it. In therapy, we use something called the Sud Scale, and I try to teach clients how to use this as well. The Sud Scale is basically 0 to 100. So, say we're talking about an anxiety provoking event, or we'd ask, like, what is your Sud Scale for that? When you think about going into that anxiety provoking situation, where are you at on the scale? 100 being, I cannot tolerate it, I would have a panic attack, I would die kind of energy. 0 would be completely fine, 0 anxiety. Middle, and when we're talking about the window of tolerance, we want to stay in the middle, where we have some anxiety about the situation, but not past like an 80, where we can't control our reactions anymore, and we can't turn back. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to say about this before I hop off. Last thing I wanted to say about this is that while noticing your triggers in the moment is a very helpful part of trauma work, by also doing other deep trauma healing work with a trauma therapist or a mental health professional, you are also helping, you would probably be working on down regulating your nervous system so that some of those triggers aren't as bad, right? So the point I was trying to make about we shouldn't avoid all triggers. Our goal in the big picture is to be lessening your reactions overall, so that some of those triggers, while they may still be triggering, they're not as triggering as they would have been. There's so much I could say about this topic, but I feel like I'd be rambling after this point. So I want to thank anyone who watches this video. Again, for those who live in Nebraska, I work out of Clearwater Counseling in Grand Island, Nebraska. So if you, unless you're a friend or a family member, which I cannot see, you can call their phone number, which is on their website, clearwatercounselingpc.org. I believe that's right. And the phone number will send you to the appointment line if you'd like to book an appointment with me. So, bye everyone. Have a good Friday or whatever day you watch this video.